together our meeting of historians for naming historical events. Next on our docket is the war that happened between the years of 1754 and 1763. Who has any ideas of what we should call this war?
Oh yes. Well, since the war happened in Europe, North America, South America, parts of Africa, the Middle East, and India, and even the Dutch East Indies down here, I say we call it World War I.
Yeah, I got a name for this war for you. We like to remember this war how, the French and the Indians, they had a very nice friendship going. So we're going to call this one the French and Indian War.
Really, the French and Indian War is the best you got.
Why not the British and French War or the British Colonials and Indian War? Okay. Just to settle this matter once and for all, I'm just going to make the decision to name this war the 7 Years' War. And that should settle all the problems. All right. Henceforth, the war between 1754 and 1763 shall be the 7 Years' War. Today we're going to talk about the events that led to the American Revolution. The 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, is the first truly global war. In fact, Winston Churchill called it the First World War. It lasted from 1754 to 1763, forming a chapter in the imperial struggle between Britain and France. Since this is American history, we are going to be focusing on the struggle to maintain their colonial claims in the New World. In the 1750s, France was expanding into the Ohio River Valley, and it repeatedly brought into conflict with the claims the British colonies had over it, especially Virginia, who had colonists moving into this territory. The Ohio Company asked the French to recognize their land claims, and the French were like, no. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely the British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonial named George Washington, yes, this George Washington, tried to push out the French from the forts that were being built in western Pennsylvania. In 1754, the French built Fort Duquesne, where two rivers met to form the Ohio River, in today's Pittsburgh. That's where my mother's from, making it a strategically important stronghold that the British repeatedly attacked. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity, with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where the French and Indians killed 2/3 of General Braddock's forces, and also General Braddock. France's greatest success was winning the support of the Indians, mainly because the French were a lot nicer to them and not trying to kick them off their land. The tide turned, though, for the British in 1759 when they captured the French forts of Duquesne in Pittsburgh, Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, that's me in Fort Ticonderoga, and Louisburg. The biggest victory came in September when the British took Montreal. With the fall of Montreal in September 1760, the French lost their last foothold in Canada. The war would go on for another 3 years, with British concentrating on seizing French and Spanish territories in other parts of the world. The British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, where France lost a lot of its colonial claims in the New World. The British received Canada from the French and Florida from Spain, and that wasn't much of a prize. It didn't even have Disney World yet. The British permitted France to keep its West Indian sugar islands and gave Louisiana to Spain. The arrangement strengthened the American colonies significantly by removing their European rivals to the north and south and opening the Mississippi Valley to westward expansion. But the real losers of the war was not the British or the Spanish or the French, but the Native Americans. The change in territories meant the French were out and the American Indians were stuck with the British, who were kind of big jerks to them. The natives felt compelled to fight back when the British colonists were encroaching on their land. With Indian rebellions a serious threat, British Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids settlement past the Appalachian Mountain Range and reserved these territories to the Indians. It sounded reasonable until you remembered that the British colonists had just finished fighting a war in order to get the right to move into that very territory. There's Gandalf. You shall not pass. So the British colonists duly ignored this proclamation line and started moving out west anyway. The British Crown borrowed heavily from British and Dutch bankers to finance the war, doubling British national debt. King George III argued that since the French and Indian War benefited the colonists by securing their borders, they should contribute to paying down the war debt. To defend his newly won territory from future attacks, King George III also decided to install permanent British Army units in the Americas, which required additional sources of revenue. So, this is going to increase the one thing Americans hate: taxes. The outcome of the French and Indian War was that it set up the American Revolution. We are already seeing the colonists ignoring King George's proclamation line and moving out west anyway. 15 years after the Treaty of Paris, French bitterness over the loss of most of their colonial empire contributed to their intervention on the side of the colonists in the Revolutionary War. Vive la France!
I was younger than you are now, when I was given my first command. I led my men straight into a massacre. I witnessed their deaths firsthand. I made every mistake and felt the shame rise in me. And even now I lie awake, knowing history has its eyes.